French court convicted Ottawa academic Hassan Diab on Friday in connection with the 1980 bombing outside of a Paris synagogue. Diab was tried in absentia, and he now faces life imprisonment after France issued an international warrant for his arrest. Diab's supporters say this is a political conviction and are urging the Prime Minister and the Justice Minister to reject any extradition requests by France. Randall Garrison is the NDP justice critic. Mr. Garrison, thanks for joining me.
Glad to have the opportunity to be here again.
I wonder, sir, if I could get your reaction to the guilty verdict for Hassan Diab that a French court issued on Friday.
Well, this is yet another of the long string of injustices toward Mr. Diab. You know, he was arrested on the request of France in 2008. He lived under strict bail conditions before being extradited to France in 2014, where he was held in solitary confinement for nearly 3 years, before a French court finally said there's not enough evidence here to proceed with a trial. And unfortunately, given the demands politically for someone to be held responsible for, which is a terrible crime, which is the attack on the synagogue in 2008, the French government then started proceedings again against Mr. Diab without any new evidence. And so here we have a clear injustice, a clear case of a miscarriage of justice in France.
You call it a miscarriage of justice and point to political reasons. A lot of Hassan Diab supporters are calling this a political conviction. Do you agree with that characterization?
Well, I would say that obviously when there's a terrible crime like an attack on a place of worship, there is a natural demand in the public to hold someone responsible. But for justice to be done, you have to get the right person. And in this case, Mr. Diab is clearly not that person.
So what do you think the government of Canada should do now? I know there were calls by your party for them to issue a formal objection in advance of the trial happening, but now we have the verdict and an arrest warrant has been issued for Hassan Diab. So what do you think the government of Canada should do at this point?
Well, what we would like to see off the bat is for the government to issue a clear statement saying Mr. Diab will not be extradited again. That doesn't really end all his legal troubles because France still has an international arrest warrant for him, but at least to provide him some certainty that the government of Canada is not going to send him back to France a second time. Now, what do I think will actually happen? I think the government has two choices. And one is just to wait and see if France formally requests extradition. Second requests for extradition are quite rare internationally. Or they can send this through the, if there is a request, they can send it through the court system and wait for a decision there. But really, what they should do is just cut this short at this point and say that Mr. Diab will not be extradited back to France.
To this point, we don't really have any certainty or clarity on what the government is going to do, right? Because Minister Lametti has been reluctant to say anything definitive at this point, citing confidentiality when it comes to extradition processes. Do you accept that argument from the Justice Minister? You
know, we had an example of extradition relations with France in 2022, where France refused to send Johannes Rivoire, the Oblate priest who was accused of crimes against children in Nunavut, and they absolutely publicly refused to send him back to Canada to face prosecution. So I don't understand why Canada couldn't do the same thing in this case and state unequivocally that Mr. Diab will not be sent to France.
I was just going to ask you about that case, about France's refusal to extradite this priest. Can Canada use that? Bargaining chip is not the right word, but can use that as an example of where France didn't cooperate with them, that Canada could point to this and say, you're not getting Hassan Diab for these same reasons?
Well, I think when the Minister of Justice points to the necessity of confidentiality and the necessity to protect Canada-French relations, that's all kind of thrown out the window by the way France treated our extradition request for someone who was accused of crimes against children, which actually are 10 years more recent than the crime which Mr. Diab is accused of.
I wonder, you mentioned that there's sort of two options where this could go, and one would be if France does make this request. I know from talking to Don Bain, who was Hassan Diab's lawyer throughout the initial extradition request, that he's gearing up for another fight if it comes to that. I mean, what are your thoughts that this could end up all the way back in court for a sequel to what was the most intensely litigated extradition hearing in Canadian history?
Well, I don't have confidence that the Liberal government will step up and take a very clear position. I think they'd probably rather avoid taking responsibility at this point and let this drag on for another 18 months or 2 years in the courts. And I think, once again, that's very unfair to Mr. Diab.
So in short of a bold declaration from the Justice Minister that they simply will not consider another extradition request from France, what would you like to see the government do next, sir?
Well, we'll be sitting and waiting to see if France actually makes the request, and the government has already told us that they won't necessarily even tell us when that takes place. So we're left in what I know Mr. Diab himself called a Kafkaesque situation, where he has no idea what's actually going to happen.
Okay, Randall Garrison, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, David.